Hey everybody, and welcome to another My JavaScript Story. This week we're talking to Dan Fernandez.
Hey, how's it going?
Now, are you still working for Microsoft?
I am. I am a principal group program manager, which means I don't know what I am, a paper shuffler right now, but that is my official title.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io. Nice. And I think we met at a Microsoft Kinect, if I remember
Yeah,
right.
a couple years ago. That's right. We were just starting our journey towards reimagining docs on Microsoft.com. Since then, we've launched Microsoft Learn, kind of a new thing that has a bunch of things that we tried to do to really enable interactive learning via the web that we can talk about as well.
Nice.
Yeah.
Now, that was in New York City. Are you from New York, or are you from Washington, or somewhere else?
Yeah, so I'm actually based in Redmond, Washington. We say Seattle,
Right.
But Microsoft headquarters. So I go out to events every now and then, probably a couple times a year, to either speak at conferences or meet with customers and things like that.
Gotcha. Sounds good. You're going to make it out to Microsoft Build, or is that less?
Yeah, I think the hard part about it is it's actually nicer to go to conferences when they're not in your home city.
That's true.
Yeah, because it's like, well, you're going to make it home for dinner and you got to pick up the kids from here and all of that stuff. When you're away, you can just kind of focus on the conference as opposed to all the other things that you have to do in your real life.
Yeah, I went to a conference last week. It was a Ruby conference up in Salt Lake City. And yeah, I was getting texts from my wife. So, are you going to be here for dinner?
Yeah.
Right? And I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough. Yeah.
A lot of the other conferences are not here. And so, yeah, it's just, okay, I'm going to call you on FaceTime. And after a half hour, everybody's done. And, I can get on with whatever I'm going to do here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Definitely more convenient.
Cool. So you're still doing learning and documentation over there.
Yeah. Really kind of thinking about kind of the future of website experiences for those things, including some of the work that we're looking at for how do we just basically help communities collaborate, which is some of the other stuff that we're just starting to look at.
Cool. Well, I think we're going to dive into that a little bit later. But to start out with, generally, we kind of do the catching up bit, and then we get into your story, getting into code and things like that. So, let's roll back a bit and talk about how you got into code.
Yeah, as a kid, I started programming. I actually went to a programming camp doing a basic, and I was kind of hooked. I was like, this is so cool, just doing basic programming and copy pasting code, which I still do, out of books. Like, hey, here's how you do this, here's how you do that, and really basic graphics. So one thing that I remember was, I think it was in high school, I started sending, I found out how to basically write to the network printer. And, I was sending like insults to a friend, but in a go-to loop. So the teacher had no idea what was going on. She assumed like the thing was hacked and like she, kept trying to figure out what was going on. I got sent to the assistant principal's office, and it was me and a friend. And he was a guy from classic New York guy. He's like, all right, so which one of you did it? And my friend, of course, knowing that it was me, just broke. He's like, he did it. And he's like, okay, you can leave. And he gets me, I'm basically in his room and I'm terrified, right? I have no idea what's going to happen. Like my mom's going to freak out. And he's like, I want you to learn one thing: never rat on your friends. And that's all he said. And I was like, oh my God, that's hilarious. This is like gangster guy. And he let me go after basically saying, don't do that again. And I was like, it was like, computers are really powerful. I'm going to keep doing this. So, I went to University of Maryland, then University of Miami, got a CIS degree there. And, web was just taking off in around 97. And I became the webmaster for the University of Miami Roller Hockey Club. So I was using Front Page at the time. Did my, I think that's my first official JavaScript, where I had a JavaScript array for images, and on hover, I would swap the images, and it was so cool. People were like, wow, this is a great website. And, those sort of fun stuff for there. So that I think would be my official first JavaScript that I wrote.
Nice. Very cool. Yeah, and it's interesting too. I've talked to a lot of people that have gotten in as younger people. It's like, oh yeah, computers, right? And that kind of carried them through. I mean, for me, it was electronics, and then in college, I got much more serious about computers.
Right.
But yeah, it's there are so many ways to come in, and it's just so interesting to see how all of that kind of carries through as you learn stuff. And yeah, the go-to loop. I remember writing some of that stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
I mean, in college, it was just kind of interesting because we took some classes for things like COBOL, right? Which was like just the opposite of,
you must be older than I am.
1998, I graduated. So yeah. So I mean,
from high school.
Yeah, that's 1998 is college. Yeah. So, but I got an internship at Pratt & Whitney doing their intranet, which really helped me get kind of basic web page editing. And I think that, honestly, the hardest part, and I still hear this from a number of people that I mentor, is getting that first job. Like the second you can kind of have that hands-on experience with that first job, it just makes everything that much easier. So once I had that, I worked for IBM after graduating college. Went into their consulting services and this was during the Y2K days. So we were working for the District of Columbia government. And just to give you an example, the District of Columbia government was so behind in Y2K, they actually had a 60 Minutes episode talking about the state of Maryland, which is right next door, and how perfectly prepared they were, and how the District of Columbia had done basically nothing. So it's funny because I still show up in B-roll when they're like doing the loops of people working on the product. There's like me and our team working on stuff. Yeah. So we did a bunch of web pages, and at the time, things like using MapQuest and JavaScript. And it was funny because they said you can't have anything dynamic. So we had to dynamically load, almost like a preprocessor you do today. Literally save the image for each MapQuest area for the maps, save dynamic charts from Excel as JPEGs, and then move them all over. So just to make sure there's no kind of security issues or anything else.
Wow.
So yeah, so that was fun. And then, you get to work on a bunch of other projects. So SonyStyle.com was Sony Electronics, their first entry into like direct to consumer purchasing for their website. This was on like CNET when it first came out and stuff like that. And, I think, I'm pretty sure it still exists today, but, we were working on things from everything on the JavaScript side to dynamic menus, to pricing wizards and things like that. So that was a lot of fun. And PriceDrive.com, which is a now dead startup, which was trying to basically be a reseller for cars. So if you go to a Ford dealership and you bring a Toyota, the Ford dealership doesn't want to buy the Toyota, but what they'll do is just resell it to another Toyota dealership, right? So it's like dealer to dealer. Hey, look, this person wants to go in. I don't want them to walk away. Will you buy this car? And that's where I think we started to see things like, I remember coding. It was the dynamic JavaScript arrays using an API where you send in Ford, and then based on that array size, it'll tell you, is there Ford Explorer, Expedition, and Mustang? Right. And, dynamically change the list. If you hit Toyota, you'd see Camry and Corolla and so on. And then the trim of vehicle to give you kind of Kelly Blue Book value for all that stuff, all using kind of JavaScript at the time, which was kind of killer. and then making it work on a compact iPad, which was kind of the first mobile web app and web development, using like one of those portable cards. It was like this thick. That's about 1.5 inches thick stuff, but it did actually work. I think the hard part was we also had to build WML pages, which were for like, the Nokia T9 pages. And,
Right.
and that was painful, but we kind of got through it. So
it's interesting. I'm a little curious, JavaScript back at that time. We're talking what, early 2000s?
Yeah, early 2000s.
So, I mean, I remember, so I got into web development around 2003-ish.
Mm-hmm.
And JavaScript was extremely painful. Like, I never would have thought that I would say that I did JavaScript, let alone that I enjoyed doing JavaScript, right?
Right.
Was that kind of the mindset for you, or were you really kind of digging what you were doing there?
So I think to this day, there's kind of this love-hate relationship with JavaScript, right? You're like, when it works, it's fantastic. And when things are going wrong, I think that it's really hard. The early days, the hardest part was, and again, I sound like the old fogey. Kids these days are spoiled with debuggers. And even just
so true.
Like the browser having browser dev tools, whether it's changing things in the DOM or changing CSS styles or, that stuff, it was just painful where you'd kind of have to alert your way to freedom, right? So it's like a dialog box. I'm inside this thing, but this thing is null. Why is this thing null? I have no idea. So I think that was just kind of a painful thing. And JavaScript reuse just really didn't happen. It was very much a copy paste world. Frameworks, I don't really remember a ton of frameworks at that time. jQuery became popular probably a little after that for all the things that we wanted monitoring to do. And now you look at it and people are like, oh, you're still using jQuery. And different teams are actively moving away from jQuery. But I think that's the other thing, which is, if you're a JavaScript developer, the skills you learn today can do basically anything, whether you're talking React Native or, if you look at Electron apps, right? Yeah. So Skype is Visual Studio Code, Slack are all Electron JavaScript apps. Those are things that we wouldn't have thought of before as kind of a JavaScript. So learning kind of those fundamentals help build the way forward for that.
Yep, absolutely. It's funny. You said the still using JavaScript. I've gotten that a couple of times, or still using
jQuery. Yeah.
Yeah, I've gotten that a few times because, I'll just throw together an app and I'll just drop jQuery in it because I don't want to build the infrastructure to run Angular or React on it.
Right.
And and then I get you're still using jQuery? And my answer is, yep, and it still works.
Yeah, exactly. Even Bootstrap, the latest version that they're going to come out with, Bootstrap 5, like one of the explicit design decisions and why it's taking so long is because they're moving away from using jQuery. Yeah. So, and people are like, dude, if it works, but there are things that you'd say, I love, being able to do really simple selectors in jQuery. So there's been some libraries that people basically built, hey, just the selectors from jQuery to make things easier. So, to each his own, but sometimes if things work, it works.
Yeah, well, the other thing is that I have found very few collisions between jQuery and something like Vue or Angular. Mm-hmm. So again, it's like, well, there's this nice feature that gets pulled in, and it has to load jQuery or part of jQuery, and in the end, it's fine. But at the same time, some of the power you get out of some of those frameworks is just like, holy crap, where was this 10 years ago, right?
Right, absolutely. And, it's funny, you always see kind of an ebb and flow. A lot of times people use JavaScript because CSS just basically sucked, right, at the time. Now CSS is so mature.
It's getting so much better. Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, so people are like, hey, I have CSS grid, I have controls. But then you see another side of people who are like, everything should be a JavaScript component, even CSS for JavaScript. Or just simple things like Sass. Sass really didn't exist, and what it meant was just the amount of duplication that you had for I mean, the classic one was just like a color that you're using on multiple pages. It's just copied everywhere. So, you know, you'd be control find replacing yourself all the time. So again, it's just kind of that spoiling it. And that's a probably good example where it can still, it's kind of built for growing up. In other words, the new SCSS can have just regular CSS in it, and then have variables as well. And that's probably a good example as opposed to some of the newer features where it really is stop what you're doing and there's no path forward, if you will.
Yeah. Now, I kind of want to get back to your story a bit.
Yeah, sure.
I kind of led us into that tangent a little myself. So
yeah.
Anyway.
So after that, I started working at Microsoft because the .com I was working at, a company called Intensity, was doubling every quarter. And then it basically started to go down. So that's like from like 25, 50, 100, 200, 400. It had awesome benefits. Like you got $400 for a car payment, access to a beach house, ski house, you know, the kegerator, like the classic .com startup, right? Yeah. But it started to nosedive, right? So my manager at the time went to go interview for Microsoft. I did as well. I got a job working in DC out of the local field office for Visual Studio, BizTalk, and SQL Server. And at the time, it then became what were called developer evangelists, which was, hey, how do we kind of show the developer community for this thing called .NET? About a year and a half after that, I went to go work at corporate to work on the Visual Studio product itself. I was the C# product manager, the third C# product manager when C# was, you know, 1% to 3%. And now, I don't know, it's probably top 5 languages, depending on what measure you use for it. But at the time, almost nobody was using it. So we tried to do everything to get folks internal and external to, you know, use C# as kind of the language for .NET. And as one of the big things we did was build a new product. So Visual Studio was always for like professional developers. And I ended up leading a team for Visual Studio Express. And Express was not for the professional developer, right? It was for, if you're a student, if you are a hobbyist or somebody just building your own website, you don't want to necessarily pay hundreds of dollars for a tool. And the other key thing we wanted to do is make it free, make it available for the web, because the old product was like 4 gigabytes, right? The first versions that shipped were 50 megabytes, and 20 of that was the framework. So we had to get a massive tool into a really small download size. Otherwise, people just would, you know, not do it. And at that time, even download speed for 50 megs was still a lot. And this is the very first version shipped in 2005, but we probably had our first demo version like 2003, 2004. And, you know, and there was a huge internal battle because Microsoft, even back to Bill Gates, had this open letter to hobbyists when BASIC came out saying, you'll kill the software industry if you make this free, because people were basically pirating BASIC. So there was, and there's a whole Visual Studio documentary that goes into this, actually, from interviews with a number of people like Anders Heilsberg, who was the C# creator, and also now TypeScript, the JavaScript with OO concepts. But, you know, we shipped it, and that included a number of products. One of them was Visual Web Developer Express, which was how do we make it really easy for people building web apps. And some of those were client apps, some of those were server apps, and so on. And as part of that, we started a new project called PopFly. Did you ever hear of PopFly before?
PopFly, that does sound very familiar.
Yeah, so this was, you know, during the Web 2.0 days. And one of the key things we wanted to do was have an interactive way, just using your browser, to build apps, mashups, and web pages. So the idea being like, one of our classic examples was a way to call Flickr APIs with these things called blocks. So the Flickr basically, and building a block was just JavaScript, right? It was, these are the inputs that I can take, which is a search term or, you know, a specific value, say a tag on Flickr. and then outputs, which is what you're going to return to me, which is like the search results. And then you can connect that with other things like a map. So, hey, let me see a real-time view of Flickr plus images on a map, for whatever search term I'm looking for artists or graffiti. And then you see this, live interactive map that you can zoom in and zoom out. And you can kind of do this with no code. And it enabled everybody to have these blocks, and that could be like searching. Dig was popular at the time, World of Warcraft, so you could find your player information, photos, stocks, contacts, news, etc. And that was a lot, very interesting, just from the things we were trying to enable, which is really democratize programming, right? So if you think about kind of the Visual Studio Express tools, and this PopFly went from kind of no code to people that actually do want to code, and also enable kind of that community of creators to build JavaScript blocks that they could easily just basically drag and drop and connect stuff to. And it kind of is kind of the if you squint, it's the Unix way, which is just build a block that does one thing, but have it designed so it can be piped from one item to another item. And these days we one of the closest equivalents is probably IFTT, if this then that. In terms of being able to take a source and then do that. So that had events and a number of other things. And then ways to visualize that with either JavaScript, HTML, or with Silverlight, which was kind of a big internal push at Microsoft at the time. I think the other thing that was really interesting for JavaScript developers is there's a number of scenarios where we had to get around things and actually call JavaScript through a proxy on the server side, right? Because I don't necessarily have the permissions to be able to send something from my machine to that, because everything has to be kind of server-side, and some of the permissions that JavaScript has to be able to do those. So we had to do that and try and do that in a secure and kind of compliant way for people to be able to reuse and filter data, which is certainly kind of enabling JavaScript developers. And the other big one was we actually enabled free hosting of HTML, JavaScript, CSS, images, and XML files. Right. So this was, maybe a good example might be like GitHub Pages, but also with kind of Java. So basically everybody got a free place to host their stuff. And then even later we did a PopFly game creator, which was, hey, how do I build using Silverlight and JavaScript 2D games, but take all the work out of 2D games? So things like animation, collision detections, all of that stuff was built in a component basis. So, I have a health bar, and I can tell my health bar to kind of go down and send it information via JavaScript events. So I think that's where I had just kind of a ton of, hey, what can we really do to push the boundaries on interactivity for the webs? So, there was a great TechCrunch article on how awesome PopFly was, and it ended up winning PC Week's top 25 products of the year, along with iPhone, and we were like, hey, yay! But I think the hard part is what happens depending on who the management is. People are like, well, I only care about enterprise, and there's, if you can't show me a way to monetize this for the enterprise, the product ends up dying. So I ended up changing teams and working on Channel 9, which is kind of Microsoft's place where we do videos and webcasts and podcasts, and doing a thing called Coding for Fun, which was totally open source projects. And again, at the time was relatively rare at Microsoft, totally open source projects that show doing cool things. So you talked about, using hardware earlier. We did things like in 2007, showing how you can send a Skype chatbot, which is your home, things to like ask if the lights are on or turn lights on and off directly, but do it basically with a custom chatbot. Or one of our other crazy projects was, and this was actually in an episode of Inside West Coast Customs, which is the show from the Pimp My Ride folks. They actually had us build a Microstang, which is a Microsoft Mustang. So take like a classic 67 Mustang fastback, add a 2012 body, and then just pimp it out with all the different technology you can imagine. So give you kind of one example back to JavaScript. It had lights everywhere. So we basically built everything as services. So to be able to light those and send those messages through, I think it was using .NET Micro Framework. It might have been an Arduino controller, or we basically made a small HTTP endpoint. So then you send JavaScript endpoints, and imagine like an array. If there's 100 lights and you want them all to be blue, then you send the color blue. If you want them all to be red, or you basically send a bunch of messages and you can see like a blue stream go through the 100 array. So you could do all kinds of animations.
Oh, wow.
Doing this and just be able to send it. And that way we were able to send it via an app or via a phone app as well. Other crazy things that car had was, if you've ever seen heads-up displays, we actually had a projection system in front of the steering wheel. So what that allows you to do is basically have Bing Maps. So you could actually, as you're looking through the steering wheel, you'll be able to actually see points of interest. So it can be like gas stations, and you'll see a point where the gas station is directly through the steering wheel, and it says how long. So yeah.
Huh.
So it had Kinect enabled, where you could do like voice and even change if somebody was close to your car, talk through it. The back seat was another HTTP client that was, instead of bumper stickers, it was a digital screen. So it had a filter on it, and then you could basically send anything you wanted to it. So either a text message by sending just like a simple string, or say, play this video, and then the entire back screen could do this. So, you could say like, hey, my phone number is this, or don't tailgate me, or cop ahead, or whatever those things, and just kind of reimagining that stuff. And just either simple stuff where we were using Fidget's controller that does a real simple on-off. So for the car horn, we turned the car horn off and plugged into the sound system. So instead of, you call it like car horn ringtones. Right, which is like, hey, tell me what to play if you want to hear, the Dukes of Hazzard or a tugboat when you press on the horn. So those kind of fun, cool projects that we did. Another one was like Lego Mindstorms, which had the ability for building JavaScript clients that could send messages, and this was kind of like Twitch plays Pokemon. So we did this demo, and it was using SignalR, which is kind of the socket IO of the .NET world. You sent it JavaScript messages, and then you voted where the Lego went. So every 3 seconds, everybody was voting, should it go up, down, left, right? It's just kind of funny because you see a ton of people just sending messages down through that, and then seeing kind of what the most popular one is. And of course, sending it back. So you see in real time, the up thing is being forward is being upvoted by everybody else, while there's a set of people that are having it go right, so it turns off the table, and that sort of stuff, which is always fun for a keynote.
Cool.
Yeah. So after all of that coding for fun stuff, we moved over to I worked using Docker and Visual Studio tools for developers. And making, basically Docker awesome for Visual Studio Code, and then Visual Studio Team System at the time. And then my manager came back to Microsoft that I'd worked on Channel Line with, and he's like, hey, we need to restart kind of the docs mission. And we, did a number of things there. And I think that's where I just realized how amazing the JAMstack is. And JAMstack being JavaScript, APIs, and markup, which is, we started with a tool called DocFX, which is like Jekyll and like Hugo, a client-side way to build. You start with Markdown, and it spits out HTML. And you can set custom templates. Those are written in JavaScript and Liquid Markup for folks who are kind of familiar with that. And it just made everything that much easier to be able to do this, as opposed to, and I think most developers today start saying, hey, I need a dynamic website. And I'm going to start with this, Node.js or ASP.NET, Ruby. And the reality is the vast majority of stuff, you really don't need it. In fact, like the number of pages that are being added in a day isn't that many, where rather than making a server-side call and paying for a server-side call, you can get 10x the performance increase by just having it be static HTML.
Yeah, I'm actually working on a project to move devchat.tv over to JAMstack.
Oh yeah? Oh, perfect. Yes.
Because again, we release We probably release a dozen or so episodes every week across all of our different shows, but
Right.
it all happens on the same day, right? Or it will very soon. So yeah, and then it's just static content. So why not?
Yeah. So, and I think that's the area where you certainly find cargo cult coders who are like, oh yeah, my blog needs to be running Kubernetes, and it's like, okay, that's a bit of an infrastructure overkill. Like, really start with static. And to give you an example, we still wanted to do a number of things dynamic. So one of the hard problems is if people want to use REST APIs and see what REST APIs Microsoft had, they were scattered everywhere. So we built one place, docs.microsoft.com/REST/API, that is an entire catalog of all APIs there. And for things like the Azure services, you can walk up and say, hey, give me all my storage accounts. Hey, you know what? Let me create a storage account, all using JavaScript. You can even log into your account and see the results in real time. So just it makes the experience of developers learning an API that much easier. And we also added the ability to do real-time run codable samples. So if you have code samples, let's say it's a bash script to automate something. You click a button, it actually launches an interactive shell. You log into your account, and then all of a sudden you're doing it directly there. So rather than, hey, I need to clone a project, hey, I need to do this, hey, I need to install software, you can do everything directly from the browser. And I think in terms of trends for developers, I think that's a huge trend that we're seeing. So a good example being like things like Stack Blitz that let you basically walk up to projects, change them. They even support things like Angular 2 and have some of the client libraries already set up for you. Or Replit as well, that gives you kind of that read, execute, print loop environment. So one of the big things that we launched in September of last year was Microsoft Learn. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the idea of like, how do we reimagine web-based learning? Because so much of web-based learning is, you're watching, right? How do we, and everybody kind of learns by doing. So one is for things that use Azure, we actually give you free Azure resources. Right. So instead of having to give you a credit card and it's like, I'm not even sure I'm ready for that commitment. Here, go play with, Azure services for free. Right. And then the interactive learning environment. Right. So that's what we call a cloud shell that basically gives you a Unix shell as well as a basic Visual Studio code editor that's open source called Monaco for creating and editing files. So, you can basically write your HTML, JavaScript, your server-side files, kind of anything that is supported in Monaco. Right. It includes client-side compilers. You can install different things and so on. And that way, rather than you having to download things or, hey, I can't get, for folks who work on Python I have Python 2.7 and 3.5 and or 3.7 and I have no idea why they're not working together, which is kind of a common thing. You now have kind of a set environment where everything's already configured so you can worry about your code. Right. And I think the other cool thing that we did there was the ability to do achievements. So when you're kind of learning, it's like, did I really complete it or not? We obviously have things like quizzes, which are just multiple choice. And one of the things we wanted to do, even just with the quizzes, rather than worrying so much about getting it right or wrong, is when you do get it wrong, you'll see why and what the reasons why, because it's more important to learn than to be right or wrong. And kind of that philosophy there. And then for the achievements part, we actually, when you do something, we deploy and monitor your app. Like, hey, you only unlock the achievement if you deploy your app correctly. We'll actually monitor, see if you deployed it correctly. And if you did, then you unlock the achievement, which is kind of the, hey, I actually did my homework. And now, if somebody has that achievement unlocked, they've actually learned that specific part.
Right. That's
so
cool.
Yeah, and I think the big thing is obviously just, when you think about the scale of things like Docs, you're talking over 100 million page views or 40 million unique customers a month. And how do you do that at scale? A lot of it really is JAMstack. Mm-hmm. But JAMstack wasn't perfect for everything. In fact, one of the things we did was build a really lightweight server-side layer to do things like update site templates and do things like A/B testing. So there are other tools that do that, but like the real core of either content or experience, everything there is just part of the Chrome. Really is kind of the only server-side part that we've had to add so far.
Right. Very cool. So anything in particular you're working on these days that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the on my personal site, on the personal side, which is, everybody has kind of their side hustle. The things that I'm looking at is a couple tools using, one, relaunching my blog on my own domain, and again, using the Hugo blog engine, which is, awesome. It's very much like Docs. It's designed to use Markdown. Which makes it really easy, but it also has the capability to do things like easily add and include. So, one of the problems with just regular plain old HTML and JavaScript, like things like menu systems, you literally have to copy paste. This does the preprocessor for that. It includes SAS support, and then using that with a couple libraries like GreenSock and Scroll Magic for the classic animated portfolio. And even some of the stuff where my default reaction might be for jQuery, there's a great repo called You Don't Need jQuery, which is here's how you would normally do in jQuery and here's how not to, as I'm trying to, learn at least some of the different ways or capabilities for not necessarily doing everything in jQuery. So, and part of that is, and I don't know if you run a Mac.
I do.
Yeah, so even at Microsoft, a number of folks, including myself, run Macs, and we use Parallels for Windows. But one of the challenges with setting up Macs is, the software to install. So I don't know if you use Homebrew or Brew.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm, started publishing kind of my my Brew bundle of all the things I installed. And one of the things that I'm working on a web project that basically is a JavaScript front end to dynamically build a Brew file. So, because people are like, hey, wow, I didn't know I could install Visual Studio, I could install Spotify, all the things that you're doing, Office, all the things that you're doing manually, including every CLI tool that you need, that you could build basically a web page that has, hey, I want to install Skype, Slack, Spotify, Visual Studio, and Office, and click, 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 and Google Chrome, Firefox, and have it kind of spit that out. So that way you can easily run a script, people are able to see it, and it's just another kind of interface for using Brew, but doing it similar to a website for Windows that has kind of its own client tool called Ninite that does basically the same thing. So those are my side projects, if you will.
Nice. Very cool. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Yeah,
sure.
Something you want to shout out about?
That's a hard one. Let me think about that. I guess one of the ones for folks who maybe aren't familiar with the JAMstack stuff is, I think it's staticsite.org, which gives you all of the resources you need for building static. Let me see if I got that right. It might be staticgen.com. I think that. Yeah, it's staticgen.com. Sorry about that. But basically, that gives you the list of all the different projects that you can use to help build static sites. If you're looking to get started, that's a great resource to at least see, and even some of the stuff around CMS tools as well.
Nice. I'll have to check that out.
Yep.
Well, I'm going to throw out another pick related to JAMstack, and that is Netlify.
Yes, absolutely.
Full disclaimer, Netlify is a sponsor.
Oh, great. Yes. Sarah Drasner, who just announced today that she is, well, actually, I don't know when this is going out. Never mind. So, but she's, yeah, just ignore what I said.
It's not going out for at least 2 weeks.
2 weeks? Okay.
I think I can get the exact date, but
okay, yeah. So if you can put it out a couple weeks later, she is going to work with Phil Hawksworth to do evangelism for, advocacy for Netlify. So, but I don't think she's disclosed that, which is my bad. I think she was going to do it in like 3 weeks. So, but it's probably just an example of like Netlify's going to have huge growth, and I really think static sites are taking off.
Yeah, we had Phil Hawksworth and Divya Sasidharan on JavaScript Jabber in January is when that episode went out, and we were talking about JAMstack, and then I need to check the date on this, but we just recorded another episode. Looks like it'll come out on May 7th, which is right around the time that this one will come out.
Okay.
From what I can tell. In fact, this will come out a week after it, I think.
Okay, perfect.
A year after Dan Shapir and Sean Clabo. And Sean's episode comes out on May 7th. So, yeah.
Okay.
So you're 2 weeks after that. So you'll be May 21st. So, folks, as you're listening to this, 2 weeks ago, we released another episode with Gareth McCumsky. And he actually on the show talked about going to work for the serverless framework folks. And we talked about how to use serverless with JAMstack. And so that's some interesting stuff. I know that Netlify has some stuff coming down the pike because they are trying to schedule a time to demo that with me, and I have no idea what it is yet. So
yeah. So
we'll see how that all goes. But yeah, interesting stuff. So if you're looking for a resource, I highly recommend that. And yeah, you can check out those other episodes as they come available.
Sweet.
But yeah, the JAMstack stuff is really, really great. And as I dug into it, just to kind of give people a little bit of perspective, I guess, on why I would go with JAMstack, because, devchat.tv is a podcasting website, right? And most people are using WordPress for that. And I've been using WordPress off and on for several years doing the podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
The issue that comes up is that I wound up installing more and more and more plugins to do more and more and more things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really all I need is, a certain level of certain things in order to, make it work. And so I found that a lot of those I could just pull in with a JavaScript library or a third-party service that has a JavaScript plugin.
Mm-hmm.
And then the rest of it, is just static stuff. And so I just have fields that go on every episode, and I'm working on getting them all tagged and everything like that. But yeah, the only concern I have with it is that I'm using a system called 11DJS. And, like a lot of the rest of these, I've used Jekyll. In fact, I'm still not sure why I didn't go with Jekyll because I'm an old Ruby hacker. But is that my show notes folks will either have to learn Markdown or I will have to find a system that will translate it for them in the rich text editor. So
yeah, so as kind of one example, the Netlify CMS, which is
that's what I'm using.
Site agnostic, actually has a option for WYSIWYG that you can basically switch and do kind of the back and forth. So, for those who don't like it and want to see what it actually output, you can, of course, just quick, preview that. And that's been one of the keys for us, too, for using Visual Studio Code for Markdown editing. And we're talking, just as one example, the Azure repo in GitHub is now the #2 repo in terms of growth for users. And one of the reasons for that is because all those pages are editable. #1, it's Visual Studio Code. #2 is the GitHub repo for a documentation repo. And that's also because we added GitHub issues using a tool, another free JavaScript. In fact, the developer of it works on our team, Jeremy Daniel, called Utterances, which allows you to use GitHub issues as kind of comments. So instead of using, there's third-party tools where you add a JavaScript API for chat at the bottom of pages, and there's a number of tools that do this. Utterances just basically uses the same thing, but the back end, if you will, is using GitHub.
Oh, nice.
GitHub issues. So that way you can kind of have conversations, threads, emojis, reactions, and so on. And it's super fast.
Yep. Very, very cool. Well, one other thing I'm going to throw out there is that I will be at Microsoft Build again, doing the same kinds of things that I was doing when I met Dan here. And I know this episode goes out after Build, but hopefully I ran into you there and we got a chance to chat.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this one up, but thanks for coming, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. And I will see you at Build.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, folks, we'll wrap it up and we'll catch you all next week. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.